The relationship between parents and children often becomes particularly strained during adolescence. It is precisely when parents sincerely strive to guide their children on the right path that their care can come at an unexpectedly high price. This story takes place in the small city of DeBary, Florida, near DeLand. The main character is Gail Cleavenger, a 46-year-old woman who was born on July 4, 1972, in a family where 6 children were raised. Her childhood could hardly be called happy. Her parents, prone to alcoholism, led a disorganized lifestyle, paying little attention to their children. They couldn't hold steady jobs for longer than a few months, getting by with temporary work. However, Gail, along with her 4 sisters and brother, found solace in their strong familial bonds with each other. Despite difficult circumstances, Gail grew up to be a strong and cheerful person. Instead of breaking under the pressure of circumstances, she strengthened her character, becoming a fearless and self-sufficient woman. From an early age, Gail showed a talent for art, first becoming fascinated with playing the violin, then taking up drawing. While dreaming of a career in the creative field, she nevertheless realized the necessity of choosing a more practical path due to the lack of support from her parents. In 1990, after finishing high school, she enrolled at the University of Miami in the architecture department. Her exceptional abilities and persistent work were recognized with honors upon graduation. The young, talented graduate quickly found work in her field, overcoming traditional prejudices against women in architecture. However, her professional successes contrasted with dramatic events in her personal life. In the mid-1990s, her first marriage turned into a real nightmare due to her husband's violent behavior. With the support of friends, Gail managed to escape from the toxic relationship and obtain a court restraining order against her ex-husband. The only bright moment of this period was the birth of her son, Gregory Ramos, over whom she retained custody. Despite the traumatic experience, Gail didn't lose faith in the possibility of finding happy love. In the early 2000s, fate brought her together with Daniel Cleavenger, a balanced, decent man who also wanted to create a strong family. After a year of careful courtship, they married. By 2018, their family consisted of Gail, Daniel, her son Gregory, and Daniel's children from his previous marriage, who had been abandoned by their biological mother. Although Gail continued to achieve professional heights, domestic challenges remained a part of her life. However, her biological son's behavior caused the most concern. Gregory Ramos, born in 2003, showed difficulties with socialization from an early age. Although he had friends, their circle remained very small. The boy found it especially difficult to communicate in new, unfamiliar situations. Trying to help her son, Gail enrolled him in Boy Scouts and karate classes. She believed that sports achievements would strengthen his self-confidence and promote the development of communication skills. Despite having step-siblings who could help with socialization, close relationships between the children never developed. All acquaintances noted Gail's extraordinary caring nature as a mother. She devoted all her free time from work to Gregory, often spoiling him. Perhaps in this way, she tried to create for her son the happy childhood that she herself was deprived of. The woman was very concerned about the boy's future, his education, and career, but reaching out to the stubborn teenager became increasingly difficult. In 2018, the family lived in a spacious house where 15-year-old Gregory, like the other children, had his own room. However, the teenager's life wasn't going well. He showed mediocre abilities at school and wasn't particularly popular among classmates. It seemed that any of his activities were initiated by his mother rather than his own desire. Gregory spent most of his time alone in his room, immersed in computer games and loud music, which he listened to late into the night. He rarely saw friends outside of school. During this period, the teenager got into several fights and conflicts that drew the attention of law enforcement. Gail put considerable effort into protecting her son from serious consequences. On the police's recommendation, a psychologist worked with the boy and concluded that Gregory had no problems with intellectual development, he simply lacked motivation and persistence in achieving goals. The difficult teenage period only exacerbated existing problems. Gail, concerned about her son's conflicts with the law, increased control over his studies, trying to distract him from computer games. Under maternal pressure, Gregory's grades improved somewhat, but he himself was very sensitive to any attempts to intervene in his life. At the end of 2018, the family situation became tense again. The school curriculum became more challenging, Gregory's academic performance declined, and his desire to study didn't emerge. His lag became particularly noticeable after covering new topics in various subjects. The mother's efforts were not in vain. Seeing positive changes in his son's studies under her guidance, Gregory's stepfather and his children also joined the process. Through their combined efforts, the family managed to guide the teenager toward his studies. On November 1, 2018, it happened that Daniel and his children went to visit relatives in another city, leaving Gail and her son at home. Despite the absence of support from other family members, the woman did not abandon her attempts to motivate her son to study. That evening, after reviewing his grades and seeing that they had again fallen below satisfactory levels, Gail had another educational discussion with the teenager. She tried to convey the importance of good education for future college admission and successful future. As always, Gregory listened to her detachedly, showing no emotions. The next day, the teenager went to school as usual. No one noticed anything unusual in his behavior. He remained as quiet and withdrawn as ever, communicating only with a narrow circle of friends. Dramatic events unfolded around 3 p.m. on November 2, 2018, when a distressed teenager who identified himself as Gregory Ramos called 911 emergency services. According to him, upon returning from school, he discovered the front door of his house broken and chaos inside. Afraid of a possible intruder's presence, the boy didn't dare to enter. Gregory informed the dispatcher that he had been absent all day, attending classes at school. He was particularly concerned that his mother's car was in the driveway, but an ominous silence pervaded the house. The teenager suggested that his mother might have gone to work with a colleague, but the broken door and disorder inside suggested a possible attack. A patrol car immediately arrived at the scene. An anxious Gregory waited for the police outside. By that time, the situation had attracted the attention of neighbors who came to support the teenager, who was clearly in a state of stress. The boy tried to call his mother several times but kept reaching voicemail. Examination of the scene showed that the door had been literally torn from its hinges. Inside the house was chaos, furniture destroyed, numerous glass objects broken. Gail's car, which stood in the driveway, showed no signs of blood or other troubling indicators. The police were particularly struck by the scale of destruction. It appeared that the perpetrator's goal was not theft but rather the destruction of property. It seemed strange that neighbors hadn't heard any noise during the rampage. According to Gregory's version, the perpetrator must have entered the house while he was in class. The most concerning was Gail's absence, whose whereabouts could not be determined. Events took an increasingly disturbing turn. Gregory's condition caused such concern that authorities had to send him to a local medical center for examination and possible prescription of sedatives. The absence of other family members in the house made the situation particularly dangerous for Gail. She was left alone with a potential attacker. Initially, suspicion fell on her first husband due to their history of violent relationships, but his alibi was quickly confirmed by surveillance camera footage and colleague testimonies. Detectives contacted Daniel, hoping to obtain additional information. He was shocked by the news of the invasion and his wife's disappearance, insisting he had no idea about a possible perpetrator. For a more detailed investigation of circumstances, Gregory was taken to the police station. The teenager was expected to actively cooperate with the investigation, given his biological mother's disappearance. However, his behavior alarmed detectives. Instead of willingness to help, the boy carefully considered each answer, and his initial emotionality changed to unusual focus. Particular attention was drawn to fresh bodily injuries on the teenager's body, scratches and bruises characteristic of a fight, including a black eye and injuries to his nose and lips. When Gregory tried to explain their appearance as a school fight, his story proved unconvincing. He couldn't name either the participants in the conflict or specific circumstances. An experienced detective, noticing inconsistencies in the testimony, began to pay closer attention to the teenager's body language. As the interrogation progressed, Gregory's anxiety increased. His constant nervous gestures, stroking his hair, rubbing his forehead, covering his eyes while answering, crossing his arms, indicated a desire to protect himself and avoid conversation. Reconstructing the chronology of the last 2 days, investigators noticed a strange peculiarity. The teenager could describe his morning and return from school to the minute, but became lost when it came to other events, such as dinner or his last meeting with his mother. This suggested careful planning of an alibi specifically for the critical time period. Despite the suspect's young age, detectives couldn't ignore the warning signals. Particularly telling was the moment when, asked about his relationship with his mother, Gregory, instead of the expected narrative, repeated several times that he wasn't involved in the murder, although murder hadn't been mentioned at that point. During the interrogation, the situation became increasingly tense. Particular suspicion was raised by the fact that Gregory himself began talking about murder, although until then only a possible kidnapping had been discussed. The teenager's behavior became increasingly troubling. He persistently denied involvement in his mother's murder, although no one had asked him about this. Trying to deflect suspicion, Gregory attempted to shift blame to some strange guys from his social circle. However, his story became increasingly contradictory. He began to get confused even about the time periods he had previously described to the minute. Pressed by evidence of inconsistencies in his testimony, the teenager finally confessed. According to him, the tragedy occurred the previous day when he returned from school. His mother had struck him because of an F in biology, which led to a fight. During the struggle, Gregory overpowered Gail and strangled her. Finding himself in a panic, he loaded the body into the car and drove around the city for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. Periodically, he was overwhelmed by thoughts, but he continued searching for a place to hide evidence of the crime. Finally, he found a secluded area with an abandoned church, where he dug a shallow grave. Attempting to complicate the body's identification, Gregory tried to remove his mother's wedding ring to pawn it. When this failed, he even attempted to cut off her finger, but after mutilating the hand, he abandoned this attempt. After burying the body, he returned home and went to school the next day, behaving so naturally that no one noticed anything suspicious. However, during the night, Gregory realized that a simple disappearance of his mother would look unconvincing. Therefore, in the morning, before school, he decided to stage a robbery. Realizing that doing this alone would be difficult and noisy, he planned to involve friends. According to police assessment, the staging was quite convincing, thanks to knowledge from the forensics club the teenager attended. However, he made several fatal mistakes. The most serious was his confession to his 17-year-old friend Brian, to whom he proudly described killing his own mother. The investigation revealed increasingly horrifying details. It turned out that Gregory had involved 2 school friends in staging the crime. The teenager hoped for their help, and although they initially took his story about the murder as a joke, they agreed to participate in vandalizing the house just for fun. During the interrogation, Gregory's friends were in the adjacent room, and their testimonies helped investigators establish the exact chronology of events. It became obvious that the crime wasn't spontaneous. Gregory acted methodically. In the morning, his friends picked him up for school, and on the way, he made his chilling confession, which they took as a bad joke. After classes, the group skipped their last lessons and headed to the Cleavengers' house, which Gregory had already started vandalizing that morning. Notably, during the destruction, some items remained untouched: a hunting rifle gifted by his father, a bow, gaming computer, and other items valuable to the teenager. After finishing the destruction, the accomplices left, leaving Gregory to implement the next part of the plan, calling the police and imitating the role of a frightened son. However, the investigation quickly revealed inconsistencies, particularly thanks to items that one of the accomplices, Dylan, had taken with him. The most difficult case was with Brian, who stubbornly denied his participation in the vandalism, even when others had already confessed. Eventually, detectives managed to reconstruct the complete picture of events, which clearly indicated a carefully planned murder rather than self-defense, as Gregory had initially tried to present it. Interviewed family acquaintances confirmed the teenager's problematic nature, admitting they weren't particularly surprised by his actions. The behavior of all three detainees at the police station proved shocking. They continued joking and having fun, not realizing the seriousness of the situation, even while discussing possible punishment. All three teenagers were transferred to the Department of Juvenile Justice in custody. Gail's body was found in the location Gregory indicated. Due to careless concealment, part of the woman's leg was even visible above ground. The medical examiner confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation. In the fall of 2018, a tragic story unfolded when 15-year-old Gregory Ramos faced serious charges. He was indicted for first-degree murder of his own mother, desecration of a body, and attempts to conceal evidence of his involvement in the crime. The court hearing turned into an emotionally charged event. The defendant Gregory repeatedly broke into tears and expressed remorse, although many present viewed his emotions skeptically, considering them an attempt to reduce his punishment. The entire family gathered in the courtroom, Daniel with his children, who still couldn't recover from the loss of Gail, who had managed to become a truly close person to them. During the hearing, many emotional speeches were delivered. Gregory himself, speaking in his defense, asked forgiveness from his loved ones for the harm caused. He particularly emphasized the innocence of Dylan and Riley, insisting on their non-involvement in the committed crime. Although the teenager repeated this multiple times, the prosecution continued its investigation, guided solely by facts. According to Gregory, his friends didn't even suspect the true scale of the tragedy, refusing to believe in the reality of maternal murder. Realizing their reaction, he tried to mask everything as a joke, inventing a story to explain the disorder in the house. Given the defendant's young age, there was a possibility of his acquittal or minimal punishment. The prosecution, seeking a compromise solution, offered a plea deal. Although the death penalty was excluded due to his minority status, such a confession could help avoid life imprisonment. Agreeing to the deal, Gregory described the fatal evening. Everything started with a conflict over an unsatisfactory grade. Initially, he just went to his room, slamming the door loudly. Trying to fall asleep, the young man couldn't shake off thoughts about his mother's hurtful words. Leaving his room, he encountered her again, which led to a continuation of the argument and a sudden outbreak of violence. The strangulation process lasted about 30 minutes until the victim showed no signs of life. The duration of the attack indicated conscious action, as during this time, he could have stopped and reconsidered the situation multiple times. Later it was revealed that between the initial argument and the tragic conclusion, Gail had called her husband, who was with relatives along with his children. She shared information about the conflict with her son. Daniel reassured his wife, promising to handle the situation upon returning in a few days. He couldn't imagine that Gregory was capable of such a terrible act. The court sentenced him to 45 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. After release, Gregory would remain under lifelong supervision. Despite Gregory's pleas for leniency toward his friends, they also faced serious punishment, up to 30 years imprisonment. The situation proved especially difficult for Dylan, who was denied bail due to a history of mental illness and potential risk of suicide or escape. Dylan spent 39 days in custody, after which he was offered bail of $200,000, which his family couldn't pay. By early February 2021, he had spent 828 days in county jail, continuing to maintain his innocence and awaiting a jury trial. The trial of the case participants unfolded ambiguously. When it came to prosecution hearings, it turned out that the evidence regarding young Dylan's complicity was insufficient to fully convince the jury. Weighing all circumstances, the judge made a compromise decision, sentencing the young man to 10 years of probation. As for Brian Porras, his situation turned out most favorably. After preliminary hearings, the court allowed bail of $100,000, which the schoolboy's parents managed to pay. Despite standard restrictions and being under investigation, Brian managed to continue his life as usual. During this time, he successfully completed his school education and even entered college, never violating court-imposed conditions. When Brian appeared before the court again on July 8, 2021, his lawyers emphasized that during 3 years of freedom, their client had proved his ability to be a full-fledged member of society, creating no threat to others or himself. However, Gail's family, particularly Daniel and his children, sided with the prosecution. They insisted that Brian was a full accomplice in the brutal crime and should have served at least 828 days in prison, the same term as his friend Dylan. In their view, this should have been followed by a 10-year probation period. Brian's defense built their strategy on the argument that the defendant became a victim of misguided actions and inadequate behavior of his friend. Although Brian did participate in vandalizing the house, the investigation found no direct evidence of his involvement with Gail's body. The lawyers emphasized that their client, trusting his friend, unconsciously helped stage the crime scene. Many people supported this position, believing that due to his young age, the boy didn't realize the full seriousness of what was happening and therefore didn't deserve punishment. The prosecution, supported by Gail's close ones, insisted on the necessity of punishing Brian. Their main argument was that even after his friend's confession about killing his mother, he didn't contact law enforcement. The defense countered that Brian simply didn't believe Gregory's words. The court's final decision determined a 14-day suspended sentence for Brian. Daniel, who became a widower, along with his supporters, believed that Gregory's accomplices deserved harsher punishment. They were convinced that they helped dig the hole and conceal the mother's body, arguing that the teenager could hardly have managed such a task alone. In their opinion, Gregory involved his friends not only in the vandalism but also in burying the body. However, eventually, Daniel found the strength to forgive the teenagers, realizing that neither anger nor revenge could bring his wife back to life. He decided to let go of the situation and move forward. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Until next time, friends.